I am very interested in the literature of transgression, particularly because it brings to light the relationship between language and the excesses which exceed language. It is a relationship between systems and their limits. And as I was reading Derek Attridge's Joyce Effects, he wrote something that really interested me and that I would like to investigate here. He says an obvious instance of the remainder at work, which he's been speaking of from Leclerc's work, is the speech or writing of many of those who are held, particularly because they use language in this way, to be mentally ill. The language of delirium, schizophrenia, glossolalia. To let one's speech be dominated by the body which articulates it, rather than subordinating diaphragm, larynx, tongue, teeth, and lips to a system, is to be regarded as passing beyond the bounds of sanity. And the same judgment awaits anyone who surrenders to the individual's power over the system, and instead allows the language, and hence the culture that has produced it, to determine what is spoken or written, which might be a series of cliches, endless lists, or constantly repeated words and phrases. This is really interesting to me because it struck a chord in terms of the relationship that language has in our culture to confirming our sanity and our ability to fit in. Because postmodernity is particularly interested in investigating the interstices and limits of our categories, one of them being sanity. We might also think of competence or mastery. All of these are intimately related to the way that we approach not only books, but life itself, other people, structures of power. And in this lecture, I would like to team out some of the relationships that postmodern thinkers, both philosophers and just writers more generally, have looked at regarding the relationship between language and madness. Because if we think about it, if we're trying to determine if someone is mentally ill, language is the principal way that we determine and recognize their diagnosis, right? You ask them a series of questions as a physician, as a psychiatrist, as a psychologist, and you try to determine their mental state. To what extent do they have normal visual and auditory acuity? To what extent are they mentally present? Are they cognizant of, contextual factors about what day is it or what time is it? Can they tell us information about themselves? Can they form coherent sentences? And as we see with that last one, with that notion of coherence, postmodernity wants to really question to what extent coherence or normality is something just objectively there. Thinkers, especially like Foucault in Madness and Civilization, are very interested in looking at the historical developments, the contingencies that have led to our notions of sanity, competency, fluency, and normalcy. And he really wants to investigate these as politically charged categories, as categories that bring with them certain discursive expectations of the subjects in those discourses. Right? So how am I supposed to act? How am I supposed to present myself? How am I supposed to speak is what I'm particularly interested in here, in order to be deemed normal, sane, clear, erudite, scholarly, etc. Foucault says in Madness and Civilization that he would like to write the history of that silence which is madness, which has been abrogated to a unique place in culture, which is precisely that it has to be absorbed and systematically made sense of, that it has to be, restricted to certain channels. And yet, nevertheless, it is given a marginalized status and constantly not allowed to express itself. And Foucault sees a certain amount of restriction going into this, a certain amount of compulsion that goes into taking certain edge cases and whittling them down in order to turn them into the human. Because for Foucault, the human, and this might be the sort of emblematic signifier for normalcy, for acceptability, for integrability, this is something that is created for Foucault, and it hides a secret of its own, a silence or a beyond that is really a capacity we have the ability to express every day, but we are told not to. Foucault says madness discloses a secret of animality, which is its own truth and which in some way it is reabsorbed. In the reduction to animality, madness finds both its truth and its cure. When the madman has become a beast, this presence of the animal in man, a presence which constituted the scandal of madness, is eliminated. Right? We make sense of that bad part of us, and we say, go over there. Not that the animal is silenced, rather, but man himself is abolished. In the human being who has become a beast of burden, the absence of reason follows wisdom and its order. Madness is then cured, since it is alienated in something which is no less than its truth. So there's a very curious dialectic going on here, whereby madness is accepted as a fact and at the same time integrated and systematized, and thereby given a sort of marginal status. And marginality is a key factor that we want to consider with madness, because of course mad people are people too. And when we start trying to sort of piece apart this category of humanity, we start getting into some unclear waters. For example, Aristotle, when theorizing the human, says that humans are rational animals. So we are animals like the other animals, but we are different from the other animals because we have the capacity of rationality. And Aristotle gets into some hot water when he starts asking, well, are women rational, or are women therefore human? And Aristotle's kind of at a loss, because on the one hand, yes, they are a member of our species, but Aristotle's predilections and predispositions to discount women and their cognitive capacities forces him to try to abrogate them to a marginal place where they are, in a sense, human, but not fully human. They don't fully have the capacities to participate in the central category of human, and they are therefore given this marginal status of woman, who is reduced to the body, reduced to irrationality, to emotion, to immediacy of sensation, and the inability to contemplate complex thoughts. And we see Foucault doing something similar with madness in his historical discursive understanding of madness. It is similarly an inside and an outside category. It is given insider status insofar as we treat mad humans different than we might treat an animal. But at the same time, there is a secret animality, an excess, a bodily effectiveness that Foucault shows as the truth of madness, that is attempted to be wrested and congealed like a piece of clay into something that can be integrated into a system. So key for Foucault is this idea that signification and identity and language are all discursive systems which are constantly trying to, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, territorialize. It is trying to actively work upon the material in front of it in order to systematize it and integrate it into something rational and whole. And with this comes certain expectations of clarity, of conciseness, of literally having the pieces be able to fit together like puzzle pieces. And anything that doesn't fit is seen as a failure, not of the system, but of the material, and therefore the material needs to be changed. So we see that there comes to be a dominance of discourse, which codes and creates bodies in their very discursive location. And we see in postmodernity an attempt to try to breach into this area of madness. I think of, for example, Henry Miller in The Tropic of Capricorn and in The Tropic of Cancer. I think The Tropic of Capricorn is really interesting because it's bodily in a very different way from Tropic of Cancer, and in it we see Miller really scooping the bottom of the barrel like a barrel from which a dead pig has been taken and has been turned into bologna or something. And we have this sort of leftovers at the bottom of the barrel that is being scooped out. But it's not being done to an animal per se, but rather to humanity itself. Miller speaks of life drifting by the show window, I too as much a part of life as the lobster, the 14-carat ring, the horse liniment, but very difficult to establish the fact. The fact being that life is merchandise with a bill of lading attached. What I choose to eat being more important than I, the eater, each one eating the other and consequently eating the verb, ruler of the roost. In the act of eating, the host is violated and justice defeated temporarily. The plate and what's on it, through the predatory power of the intestinal apparatus, commands attention and unifies the spirit, first hypnotizing it, then slowly swallowing it, then masticating it, then absorbing it. The spiritual part of the being passes off like a scum, leaves absolutely no evidence or trace of its passage, vanishes even more completely than a point in space after a mathematical discourse. Later he writes scathily, "In the belly of the trombone lies the American soul farting its contented heart out. Nothing goes to waste, not the least spit of a fart. In the golden marshmallow dream of happiness, in the dance of the sodden piss and gasoline, the great soul of the American continent gallops like an octopus, all the sails unfurled, the hatches down, the engine whirring like a dynamo. The great dynamic soul caught in the click of the camera's eye, in the heat of rut, bloodless as a fish, slippery as mucus, the soul of the people miscegenating on the seafloor, pop-eyed with longing, harrowed with lust." So we can see in Miller's writing a unique willingness to transgress lines between subject and object, between human and non-human, between object of concern and object of lambastation or integration. All of these functions are congealing in this mass of emotion, of affect, of lines constantly being transgressed. So we can see in Miller's writing always a teeming on the edge of madness. And that's one of the interesting things that we see in both the theories about madness, such as Foucault, and in the writings that try to invoke it, is constantly living on the edge, not willing to buy wholesale into the category of madness, which itself is discursively defined, right? What do we expect a mad person to do? How do we expect a mad person to fit into our systems? To act mad in that sense is itself a form of conformism. So Miller is so mad because he presents himself as so other, giving us, mixes of objects that we didn't think could go together, sensations that we didn't think could complement each other in such a way. And yet, nevertheless, they sort of bustle and congeal together in a way always teeming on excess and always invoking that excess, while at the same time coaxing it out of us as readers. So there is an attempt in what Foucault would call archaeology, an archéologie du savoir, archaeology of knowledge, to see in the forms through which knowledge is given, like literature, for example, an attempt to grasp madness without wresting it, right? Without reducing madness, there is an attempt to invoke it. And no one invokes madness quite like Antonin Artaud. Artaud is really interesting to me because we see throughout his writings an attempt to vocalize cruelty, madness, excess, violence, violation, all of these for a properly aesthetic effect. It's not a sort of utilitarian sense of, oh, we will get something better for society if we learn how to speak the madman's language, so to speak. No, that would be way too conformist, an attempt to try to reduce madness to a language of its own. Instead, Artaud and people like him want to reduce language to a madness precisely by exceeding language, by showing that madness is a limit, a positive limit to the infinity that writing is always teeming on. And we get so many examples of this in Artaud's writing, it's hard to choose one. He says, to exist, one need only let oneself be, but to live. One must be someone, to be someone, one must have a bone, not be afraid to show the bone, and to lose the meat in the process. Is God a being? If he is one, he is shit. If he is not one, he does not exist. The space of possibility was given to me one day like a loud fart. that I will make, but neither of space nor possibility did I know precisely what it was. And I did not feel the need to think about it. They were words invented to define things that existed or did not exist in the face of the pressing urgency of a need. The need to abolish the idea and its myth, and to enthrone in its place the thundering manifestation of this explosive necessity, to dilate the body of my internal night. The internal nothingness of myself, which is night, nothingness, thoughtlessness, but which is explosive affirmation that there is something to make room for, my body. And the invocation of the body made so strongly by Artaud here is present in the very writing. It hits one's body in the process of speaking it, in the very thought of thinking it, which can often bring one to participate in bouts of despair and depression, as it oftentimes has me as I read thinkers like Artaud. But nevertheless, it opens up a space of possibility where we precisely get to talk about the limits of what can be talked about. We can talk about our talkings about talking about. It's a sort of meta churning over language itself that is so interesting and something so intensely threatening to structures of power. And hence, to go back to Attridge at the very beginning, there is something very interesting about people who go beyond linguistic constraints, who go beyond our notions of fluency, of communicability. Right? These are the people who often get branded as mad. These are the thinkers who totally destroy our idols, to use a Nietzschean phrase, to such an extent that they themselves are branded as the madman, and this may in fact be part and parcel of their madness, which many of them literally clinically succumb to, such as Nietzsche and Artaud and many, many more. I think of Hölderlin as well. Here we see a nothingness, a thoughtlessness, which nevertheless is explosive and affirmative. This is the body itself. It is the extent to which language can be used to signal and invoke the non-linguistic. And this is precisely the opposite of the sort of idealistic enclosure of some of the theories of language in the early 20th century, which try to reduce reality, reduce being, reduce life to a mere language. The implication that language is systematic, that it is communicative, that it is referential, that it is representative. All of these are part and parcel of classical notions of epistemology and ontology. We assume that, for example, when I use the word book, I am referring to some entity external to me, the speaking subject, who is trying to accord an object in the world to a signifier, which I invoke in the act of communication, and the result of and the point of language is supposed to be to communicate something in its maximum state of fidelity. These are all aspects of language that are being seen by the postmoderns as reductive, as something language can do, but not all that it can do. That language can be more than just a mere reflection or mirror of beings, but something which exceeds and transgresses the very beings that they evoke. And that's something so interesting that has really drawn me to the thought of Deleuze and Guattari, especially in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. And this is something that has long turned off readers to Deleuze and Guattari, is the fact that they invoke the very schizophrenic glossolalia that Derek Attridge speaks of at the beginning of this lecture that I invoked, that so often gets branded as mad, as mere nothingness, as dribble, as gobbledygook. But I think that Deleuze and Guattari really want to show the limits of language, of theory, of evocation, and of feeling in a way that invokes schizophrenia at the same time it becomes an object of study. And an object of study precisely insofar as it is something to which we are pointing, something we are talking about, but without reducing it. We are trying to approach the schizophrenic as someone worthy of consideration, worthy of interest. And that is the real appeal to me of transgressive literature, is it takes a wide berth of of possible subjects, and it says that they are in fact subjects worthy of being talked about, and that they can be appreciated in their objectivity in the way that they assail our discourses and the way that our discourses try to resist them. And by looking at those discursive dynamics, postmodernity gives us a way to talk about others that we tend to marginalize, not necessarily because of some sort of active hate, but simply because the way our society works, it is constantly trying to resist and reduce for the sake of productivity and profitability. The way that capitalism works, Deleuze and Guattari show, is so against schizophrenia. And schizophrenia for them is really key. I like to go to this passage in Deleuze's Negotiations, which I think is really central to framing the way we talk about schizophrenia in Deleuze and Guattari's oeuvre. He says, we're considering a very simple problem, like Burroughs with drugs. Can you harness the power of drugs without them taking over, without turning into a dazed zombie? It's the same with schizophrenia. We make a distinction between schizophrenia as a process and the way schizophrenics are produced as clinical cases that need hospitalization. It's almost the same thing in reverse. The schizophrenics in hospitals are people who have tried to do something and failed, cracked up. And this is something that it is not just the schizophrenic's fault, but it is also the discourse's fault, which demands certain things of the schizophrenic as a subject. And they cannot fulfill that role with the current tools that they have available, mentally, cognitively, bodily, intellectually. We're not saying revolutionaries are schizophrenics. We're saying there's a schizoid process of decoding and deterritorialization, which only revolutionary activity can stop turning into the production of schizophrenia. Right? So we're trying to use schizophrenia as a sort of limit to our thought in a way that doesn't turn thought in on itself, that doesn't turn catatonic, but rather turns outward, turns cosmic, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it. Deleuze and Guattari want to enact the rupture with causality that forces a rewriting of history on a level with the real, and produces this strangely polyvocal moment when everything is possible. That's really the revolutionary moment that is constantly hearkened to and created in transgressive literature and in postmodern theory. Of course, the schiz has been prepared by a subterranean labor of causes, aims, and interests working together. Of course, this order of causes runs the risk of closing and cementing the breach in the name of the new socius and its interests, right? This risks getting co-opted as an impulse and turned into a systematic discourse of its own, which discloses its own possibilities and which marginalizes its own subjects in new ways. Of course, one can always say after the fact that history has never ceased being governed by the same laws of aggregates and large numbers. Yet the fact remains that the schiz came into existence only by means of a desire without aim, or cause that charted it and sided with it. While the schiz is possible without the order of causes, it becomes real only by means of something of another order, desire. The desert desire, the revolutionary investment of desire. And that is indeed what undermines capitalism. Where will the revolution come from, and in what form within the exploited masses? It is like death. Where? When? It will be a decoded flow, a deterritorialized flow that runs too far and cuts too sharply, thereby escaping from the axiomatic of capitalism, which is the profit motive. Will it come in the person of a Castro, an Arab, a Black Panther, or a Chinaman on the horizon? A May 68? A homegrown Maoist planted like an anchorite on a factory smokestack? Always the addition of an axiom to seal off a breach that has been discovered. Fascist colonels start reading Mao. We won't be fooled again. Castro has become impossible, even in relation to himself. Vacuoles are isolated, ghettos created, unions are appealed to for help. The most sinister forms of dissuasion are invented. The repression of interests is reinforced. But where will the new eruption of desire come from? And that invocation of newness is at the heart of postmodernity's relationship to language as transgression, to madness as something which can be articulated if we live on the edge, if we learn how to saddle the right horse, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. And this is why I think Joyce's Finnegans Wake is the postmodern text par excellence, because it is a postmodern text before postmodernity is a thing. And it is at the interstices of its current cultural moment attempting to diagnose the aspects of marginality so inherent in language itself. And in order to do that, it must transgress all those expectations of what language is supposed to do. It contrasts with language viewed as a tool of representation, or communication, or clarity, or fidelity. In contrast to that, it gives us the excess of the madman. It gives us, enacted on the page, glossolalia. And glossolalia is so interesting because one of the other ways that we see glossolalia in our culture today, and we have for hundreds of years, is in the Pentecostal movement of Christianity, in speaking in tongues. This is literally what glossolalia is. Speaking in tongues is glossolalia, and glossolalia is speaking in tongues. And if we think about the word tongues, I mean, tongues is a sort of synecdoche that we use for languages, right? My mother tongue. But the tongue is a uniquely bodily aspect of ourselves by which we invoke language. And it always signals, I think, that animality, that limit, that edge case of the body itself that resists schematization and systematization, which we see enacted in Finnegans Wake. This is the reason that it still creates so much theoretical upswells, is because it can't be systematized, because it can't be decoded or decorded, as Finnegans Wake would put it. And I think this is really a great place to be in as a literary scholar, as a philosopher, because we have all these wonderful pieces of theory and literature which test the limits of the very discourses they invoke. They ask us as subjects to question our very subjectivity, ask us to question the very tools by which we go about our trade. As such, I think that postmodernity is the discourse through which we can analyze madness and analyze the extent to which language acts as a normative mechanism of our society, the way that it is used to reinforce being reasonable, being rational, being normal, and therefore acceptable and able to be hired, for example, or able to be elected as a politician or representative. All of this is terribly important to the way that we run our societies, and yet postmodernity I still see castigated as a sort of boogeyman. I think of Jordan Peterson famously, or rather infamously, discussing postmodern neo-Marxism, which is just the worst conflation and contradiction in terms that can exist. They are traditions that are opposed to each other in critical yet subtle senses. But I think that postmodernity can still be influential and relevant to our culture en masse if we learn to treat our language the way postmodernity expects us to, as a legitimating tool and something with fuzzy edges that can always be investigated both in theoretical and outside theoretical discourses. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope some of these ideas have been helpful in terms of thinking about madness and language and postmodernity. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I slowly get enough that I need to present y'all with this content, but no pressure, care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.